people fought against it and they tried to stop it. So yes, it was a mistake then, and it's led to some of the very severe problems we have today, the increasing polarization there is in countries and globally. These things have happened precisely because of those changes in policy.
Hi, I'm Joelle Alexandria, your host for A Future for Us podcast, where I discuss social and environmental journalism. Today, I will be talking with Nick De Carlo, co-founder of Seniors for Climate Action. In this discussion, I talked to him about how Seniors for Climate Action came from his recollection of the environmental movement in Canada in the 70s and 80s, and how the generational divide between seniors, primarily baby boomers, and Generation Z are a part of the environmental conversation. Let's see what he has to say. Welcome to part 1.
Hi, my name is Joelle Alexandria, and I host A Future for Us, and I'm here with Nick De Carlo.
And I'm Nick De Carlo. I'm with Seniors for Climate Action now, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yes, thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. So, what is Seniors for Climate Action?
Seniors for Climate Action now, we're an organization of seniors started about 3 years ago, and we have grown fairly quite quickly. And our main objective is to organize seniors to be part of the climate action movement to address the climate crisis, which of course is getting worse all the time.
Yes. And how has Seniors for Climate Action rectified the, social disparity between, seniors or people over 65? Do you consider that?
Yeah, 60, 65 isn't.
Okay. So how do you give them, I don't want to say purpose, but how do you make sure that they're an integral part of society when so many people cast them off in terms of them not having an economic impact or being above or at retirement age?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's not that seniors don't have an impact; it's just that people think they don't, and it's also that seniors, generally, you're kind of set aside, as you say. But seniors are concerned about the climate crisis in particular, and for a number of reasons. And so we, as seniors who began Seniors for Climate Action now, felt that need to find a way to be active, to do something about the problem. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And in the process of organizing around that, we've actually begun to understand more about how seniors can be more respected in society.
That's good. And when did the organization start?
So we started had our first meeting of about 20 people in July of 2020. And by January, we launched our organization, had a name, set up a structure. And so January 2021 is when we really got underway.
Okay. And so what are the types of things that you do around Toronto? Is Toronto the home base of this organization?
We're actually through Ontario primarily. We also have members across Canada. We have something like 45 members in different parts of the country as well. We're primarily focused on Ontario, and the reason for that is because when we started out, we didn't think we could be anything but a more locally focused group. But we have regional groups in Ottawa, Kingston, Kawartha Lakes, Toronto, of course, and Northumberland, and Barrie. So we're developing those groups, and they're expanding. And I forget your original question.
Oh, what do you guys do around Ontario?
Okay, so we started out primarily in developing webinars and analysis, political analysis, and critique of the government's policies on climate crisis. We said the other thing is that when we started, we committed ourselves to supporting youth, and because youth are the ones who are going to be most impacted, it's their future, and we felt it was important to follow the leadership or the direction that youth were taking. So our activities started with attending demonstrations. The first demonstration we attended as an organization was September 2020. And we've been to the demonstrations up to most recently, and we're involved in organizing on September 16th in Toronto, but also in other cities around the province. So we combined political analysis, research, education webinars and activism in the demonstrations in particular. As time goes by, our role is evolving and we're developing activities in new areas. And I can explain that a bit about that whenever you want to know.
Yeah. So when you guys are doing political analysis and like organization, these are volunteers in the organization who are like contributing.
It's an entirely volunteer organization, and we have people who did research as a career. And so now when they do the research for our organization and do excellent research, excellent educationalists. And we have people who've written books. We have people who are history of activists in various parts of the activist movement, and all of them contribute in various ways.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So one day in particular comes to mind. I think April 1st, 2023, you organized your organization organized like a strike on RIBC.
So what that was we called it Fossil Fuels Day instead of April Fools. And it was focused on RBC, which is the largest bank in Canada, but not just that, the largest, it's the bank that invests most heavily in oil and gas in the world. It actually leads the world in those investments. And so because we know fossil fuels and oil and gas are what's causing the environmental crisis, that's the fundamental problem that we face going into the future. The focus of attention on RBC was important. And there was a series of demonstrations across the country that day, and we supported the one in Toronto and were part of attending, and we brought out, I think, 50 or 60 seniors to that demonstration.
And so you're protesting fossil fuels. So what's the connection between RBC and the fossil fuels?
Well, so they're the biggest investor in fossil fuels in the world in terms of banks. And so the problem with fossil fuels, what they're doing, let's give you an example. They're supporting the expansion of pipeline, it's called Coastal GasLink, across Wet'suwet'en territory. There's a resistance from the Wet'suwet'en, who have the historical rights to the land. It's non-ceded land, and have said they don't want the pipeline to go through. That's the traditional leadership of the Wet'suwet'en. RBC is supporting the pipeline going through, investing in it, and the RCMP has been very active in suppressing any resistance to that. So they're right when it comes to oil investment, they're right behind it.
And so how do you think that you were able to change, or your organization was able to change that? Was it just bringing awareness? Is it calling upon government leaders through your researchers and your analysts as well?
So here's the thing. We don't think it's going to change without a very powerful mass movement. Mm-hmm. And so when we attend a demonstration like that, it's to expose the role of RBC, and it's to try and build support in the population for building political pressure. And so it's one step. It's one piece of a much broader, more long-term strategy, which is to bring to the attention of the public the problems that are causing the climate crisis, and to try and convince people that it's important that we all act together to do something about it. And if we don't think that things are going to change.
Yeah, I agree. So how did you get involved in the environmentalist movement?
Well, I was active in the union movement for many decades. And one of the things that's interesting about the environmental movement in the 70s and into the 80s, starting with Rachel Carson's book in particular, was the environmental movement brought to public consciousness toxic chemicals and things that were harming people and were harming the land. And there's a very strong movement through the 70s and 80s, environmental movement against those things. And a lot of new legislation was brought in. Interestingly, at the same time, within the workplace, the information that people were hearing from the environmental movement about toxic chemicals raised the consciousness of those of us in the workplace who were organizing to protect workers' rights. And as we discovered that people were dying from workplace exposures, there was a health and safety movement developed. I was very involved in that movement, the place where I worked. And we managed to win a victory where we got toxic chemicals what's it called, the ventilation systems. And but then the thing was, well, where's that going? And it was going into the air, into the communities around us. And that's where the connection. connection between what was happening in the workplace and what was happening in the environment. And that raised a number of questions for me. A major turning point for me was reading David Suzuki's book called The Matter of Survival, and where he talked about the climate crisis and the coming problems in 1989, 1990. So I've been involved around that issue since. And so my job after that, 1994, I became representative of the Canadian Auto Workers around environment. So I've been involved in the environmental movement since 1990.
Okay. And so you mentioned David Suzuki and Rachel Carson. So David Suzuki runs the Suzuki Foundation, and it was founded, I think, in British Columbia, because that's where he was stationed. And also Rachel Carson was a prominent U.S. environmentalist author. So have you read their work before you started coming into contact with this environmental movement through your work, or was it mostly after you realized, oh, this is important, that you sought after their literature?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I have to think about that a bit, because I'm not sure exactly. But I think what happened was that it was in the air. For example, but not meant as a pun, but the environmental movement was talking about toxic chemicals. There was a whole movement around acid rain and the impact that was having. There were various laws passed around toxic chemical exposures. I remember there was a big thing in New York, and I think it was the Erie Canal. There was a huge problem with the water being totally polluted. There were issues like that the environmentalists were fighting around, and so that was in the air. It was talked about on the news. It was a part of public awareness, and that understanding of chemicals and how they impacted on people, sort of went into the workplace, because everybody's aware of these things. And so that's where how the connection was very organic, I think. I haven't actually read Rachel Carson's book. I know about Rachel Carson. I haven't actually read the book. The Suzuki book I did read. I haven't read a lot of books, but it was enough to tell me there's a problem and we have to do something about it.
And were you able, in the 1980s or the late 1980s, were you able to find community during that time, or was it just you individually, oh, this is what's going on?
So what we did, so I was the president of a local McDonnell Douglas, which is an aircraft plant, and I don't know how much detail to go into, but we organized. It was at the same time as the plant closures were happening because of the free trade agreement between Canada and the U.S. And Mexico at that point. And those plant closures were happening. People were being thrown out of work. There was an environmental crisis beginning to loom. And our argument was we should actually take the plants that were closed, the factories that closed, open them to build green products. And we would create jobs and move the economy in a different direction. So we started a group called Green Work Alliance. And this was our union local with a number of other union locals, with environmentalists. And that's the first time I started working with other environmentalists, with anti-poverty organizations. And we formed this group. And, I can tell you a lot more about it, but the basic idea was just that. Our slogan was turn the Rust Belt into a green belt. And so that's where we came into contact with environmentalists. It's the way we started getting among the workforce. It was real strong support for it, because part of what we were arguing was we needed to produce socially useful products, not just products, but socially useful ones. And that workers should be part of designing what those products are, and they could be. And that appealed to people. And we wanted to set up public corporations where workers would be involved in designing the product, in addressing the problems we faced around the environment, and try and build a new kind of a society through that kind of approach. We couldn't get very far because we didn't have the resources to really develop it further, but the potential was there, and it was clear to me that kind of alliance could be accomplished.
Yeah, that's interesting, because nowadays you hear that people have the connotation that the environmentalist movement is a threat to workers, because it's oh, you're taking away all the jobs because you're trying to make everything green. And so then what are we going to do? It's going to take a while to produce jobs. So it's interesting how you have that more renewable or renewable aspect, but in terms of people, where they're kind of like not, well, like it's more of like they're kind of in charge as well. So like not just they're working there just to get a paycheck, they're part of the process. I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, and yes, absolutely. Because you can't, I guess the way I looked at it back then is, if you're trying to protect animals, why wouldn't you be trying to protect people? I mean, there's no distinction. We actually have to change that. The environmental movement is a justice movement as much as it is a climate movement or a nature movement. So we have to solve social problems at the same time as we solve environmental problems. They have the same source, so let's deal with it.
You talked a bit about seniors for climate action because they want to like empower the future. I imagine like because they have like grandkids and kids, or is it like more than that?
It is more than that. It's certainly that. I mean, there's no question that that's a motivator. It's a very powerful motivator for people. They're concerned about the future, and it's sort of a hidden fact in a sense, and we're trying to bring it out in the open that there are 10 million people. I'm not saying every senior feels the same way, but there is a whole cohort of people in the country who do care about the future. But the other thing is that seniors will be very directly impacted by climate crisis. So when there was a heat wave, it was 2 years ago in BC, where I think it was something in the range of 900 people, but I can't quote the exact number. But a good percentage, the majority of those people were seniors who died from the heat wave. So seniors are impacted because they are often it's poverty among seniors. When you're retired and you don't have much in the way of a benefit plan, you have a fixed income as inflation eats into it, and so you're isolated. You're relatively poor, and you don't have the kind of protection that other people might have, and so seniors will be impacted in that way. Or often, for example, if you have a interruption in electricity because of severe storms, you'll have people who are on rely on medical equipment, or they if their furnace goes off, they can't do anything about it. There's nothing to do, or if there's extreme cold, etc. Right? So seniors are kind of in the front lines of being impacted by the climate crisis as well. So it's both. It's both the concern about the future, but it's also recognition that seniors are vulnerable.
I see. That's very interesting because you never really look at it that way. You're always thinking about, the future, like the younger people in the future who are experiencing it. But I definitely appreciate the fact that seniors are impacted too.
It's interesting because it's not the future anymore, in one sense, right? It's here. Mm-hmm. When I started working on this in 1990, it was the future.
Yeah.
It's not the future anymore.
So what are some differences that you see in terms of like fighting for climate action in like the 80s and 90s to like now? Is there any like key differences? I know social media is has a big impact.
So climate action wasn't as much of a public awareness in the 80s and 70s as it is now. There's a number of factors I want to get into if I could do this.
Yeah.
It wasn't as much of a factor, but the environmental movement was able to make a lot of gains in the 70s and 80s because there was quite a strong social movements that there was a whole strengthening of communities and social movements. In the 80s, the whole economy changed and shifted, and that affected communities. So there was a real move for government to get out of, to privatize government corporations, for government to be out of the way, to turn things more over towards the market, and at the same time subsidization of community groups, especially in Canada. There was all kinds of funding that was taken away that was available to community groups before that, and the ability to put pressure on government and business changed, because before the production was much more localized, and the economy was always growing, so you had a pressure points. Once they shifted the economy in the 80s into the 90s, those pressure points were not eliminated entirely. They were really altered. Government stepped back. Private corporations took more of a role in the economy. Everything was about the market, whereas before there were other issues that were also important, including the environment. And so the context changed, and there was a lot of setbacks. Environmental legislation that was there was eliminated. There have been huge setbacks in terms of that kind of thing. So as we go into the period that leads to today, when we're building the environmental movement, it's starting from a more difficult place. And we're also, the other thing that's about this last period of time is that crises are intensifying. Economic crises are intensifying. Global war and political crises are intensifying. Competition between countries is intensifying. And in that context, we have two problems. One is that people, what's on their minds is what's immediate. It's that, they need a place to live. They need to be able to provide food. They have to worry about their families. So when you talk about the environment, it seems too far away. It's not the immediate issue. And the other trouble is that people around the world are divided, they're fighting each other. And we need to be together if we're going to deal with the environmental crisis. So in some ways, we're in a much more difficult organizing position than we were back then.
Yeah. So would you say it was a mistake to take away the government part and add companies to it? Because I feel like nowadays we're starting to realize, that might have been a mistake. We need to go above the companies to the government and have them actually crack down on this.
Yeah. So, if you want to talk about the role of the people who are seniors today, there was a major fight in Canada in particular, but across the Americas around exactly that move. When that happened, people fought against it and they tried to stop it. Mm-hmm. So yes, it was a mistake then, and it's led to some of the very severe problems we have today, the increasing polarization there is in countries and globally. These things have happened precisely because of those changes in policy.
So now that we're in hindsight and realizing that was a mistake, do you think that it's fair when people say that baby boomers did this and that they are the ones that ruined it for the rest of us? Or were baby boomers just as blindsided by the environmental crisis?
All the way through history, people have fought some of the things that have happened. So those people there, the baby boomers, were also the ones who fought against the war in Vietnam, for example, fought against war in those days, that took on issues of social justice. Not all society was doing that. There are plenty of people in that generation who were on the other side of those things. So there was a constant not battle, but there were different aspects of society then, just as there are now. But certainly there was activism throughout that period that increasingly recognized the environmental crisis as very central, that continues today within that generation. It's interesting, though, and one of the things we really try to do in Seniors for Climate Action now is to demonstrate to young people that we do care. Because when you grow up as a young person, you don't know that history. Mm-hmm. You don't know that people fought these things, and that and it wasn't just. And also, people interpret it as this is problem of individuals. It's not a problem of individuals. It's very much a problem of government policy, of market philosophies, et cetera, that have existed through that whole period of time. Mm-hmm. So I think it's I don't claim that we couldn't have organized better. It would have been if we'd done more, it would have been good. But people fought and did their best.
Yeah. So then, why do you think there's this negative connotation around the generational divide and how baby boomers don't care? Do you think that that's starting based on the growing economic crisis and people being kind of resentful about how easy it used to be, I guess?
I think that's a factor. I mean, I think, and there was if when you talk about these things, you're talking about the general awareness in society and the general philosophy of society in the 60s and 70s, those things would always get better. We'll just have more. Mm-hmm. In the 80s and into the 90s, it was, we'll look after ourselves because things are getting bad. So you look after yourself, right? And government steps out of things, et cetera. So there is reason to feel that the previous generations, because they include the policymakers, didn't act when they should have, right? There is reason to think that, but there was within that a fight to try and get those problems solved, and that's often what people aren't aware of.
I see. Yeah, I definitely see a lot of the isolation and a lot of the individuality. A lot of the times when I talk about my move from like New York to Canada, I noticed that like a lot of the culture is similar because there is individualism in these two countries.
Mhm.
But a lot of people are complaining about it nowadays. Like in my generation, they often talk about there being no like third location. Like
Okay.
so
I'm not
basic-
familiar with that one.
yeah, so let me explain. So basically, a third location is like a community center or
Okay.
a park or a place where people can go and gather safely
Right.
without having that consumerism. So nowadays, the third location is the mall or I guess like going to a coffee shop. But there's always that consumerism aspect to it. But then there's no places, or nowadays there is a growing movement to have more third locations that are safer and that just promote children, or I guess not even children, but just people being,
Yeah.
instead of consuming for enabling them to feel something or connectedness with each other. So I definitely feel that, and it's definitely it's a problem people are aware of, but I'm not sure they know how to fix it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and something that I wanted to talk about is the link between environmentalism and capitalism, because I notice more that like people are looking towards like socialist ideologies or even communist ideologies to be like, hey, we need to like be unified in this. But at the same time, you can't really force it that way because it's brought on so many problems in history. So I was wondering if you would like to, you personally, not your organization, but
Yeah,
you
yeah.
would like to like talk about, what do you think about that?
Thank you for tuning into part 1. This has been your host, Joelle Alexandria, with a Future for Us podcast, where I conduct audio documentaries, interviews, and stories as it pertains to us in our modern world. Check out our Instagram, A Future for Us, and for inquiries, email afutureforus99@gmail.com. Stay tuned for part 2.